Welcome to On the Issues with Michelle Goodwin at Ms. Magazine, a show where we report, rebel, and tell it like it is. Now, on this show, we center your concerns about rebuilding our nation and advancing the promise of equality. Join me as we tackle the most compelling issues of our times. On this special episode, we focus on toxic masculinity in the United States, including online misogyny and how it translates into real world violence, highlighted most recently in the horrific murder of Daniel Anderl. He is the son of U.S. Federal District Court Judge Esther Salas and the shooting of her husband, Mark Anderl. The person assumed responsible for those tragedies is Roy Den Hollander, a self-proclaimed men's rights activist. He is part of a growing movement of men who describe themselves as frustrated by women. He took his own life. However, we come to you not only in the wake of Judge Salas's unspeakable grief. Recently, Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez was accosted by Representative Yoho, her colleague from Florida. Representative Yoho called her disgusting, pointed a finger in her face, used slurs, and at first denied it, but then refused to apologize for it. He was overheard by reporters, and some may wonder, if reporters had not been present, would she, Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez, have been able to tell her story? Now, Representative Yoho claimed that it was his passions that got the better of him and offered what many would describe as a rambling floor speech in which his daughters and wife were centered. Was this using his wife and daughters as a shield? For some women, this looked like typical workplace misogyny that they endure all the time. Yet we know the culture of toxic masculinity relates to more than just a week's worth of humiliations. What can we learn from these incidents and others? What lessons can be drawn? And has toxic masculinity gone too far? Joining me as we talk about incels, the ways in which racism intersect with misogyny in the US and on the internet and in the anti-feminist movement are three very special guests. First, I have with me Jill Flipovich. She's a columnist for CNN, a contributor to the New York Times, a lawyer, and the author of the forthcoming book, Okay, Boomer, Let's Talk, How My Generation Got Left Behind. She's also the author of H-Spot, Feminist Pursuit of Happiness. Also joining me is Dr. Saida Grundy. She's an assistant professor of sociology and African American studies at Boston University. Her research explores the intersections of race and masculinity, rape culture, and campus sexual assault. Professor Grundy is author of the forthcoming book, Manhood Within the Margins, Promise, Peril, and Paradox at Historically Black Colleges for Men. Now, also joining me today is Dr. Jackson Katz. He is an internationally acclaimed educator, author, scholar, activist on issues of gender, race, and violence. Through his books, documentaries, and public speaking and articles, he has tackled issues of masculinity, racism, and violence. Thank you very much for joining me today. Jill, let me start with you. Last week, you wrote a piece for CNN. You said, while the targeting of a federal judge and her family is shocking, Den Hollander's violence shouldn't be surprising. This is, after all, a man who called the Violence Against Women's Act female fraud, a female fraud act, only to then allegedly commit violence against a woman's family. What do we know about the killer?
We actually know quite a bit about Den Hollander. We know that he was active in men's rights circles. Not that anybody wants to do this, I spent a few hours of my day going through the writings he's posted on his website, many of which are a bit incoherent, but do paint a picture of a man who very much resented women's power, who very much resented women having equal rights to men, and who had frankly constructed this entire worldview that was premised on the idea that it's actually women who are in positions of power, not men. Despite looking at kind of the same landscape that all the rest of us can see, right? Which is a male-dominated Congress, not a single female president in the history of the United States, men dominating at every level of business. He still managed to look at that landscape and say, well, obviously it's women who are really in charge and it's men who are the ones who are being quite oppressed. And unlike, I think, a lot of our stereotypes about, so-called incels, which I don't know that Den Hollander actually identified as part of that community. He wasn't this kind of like basement dwelling loser. He was a lawyer. He had by all accounts, a relatively successful career that seems like it was being hampered a little bit by his extremist views. But he was a relatively productive public-facing member of society, which I think is an important point, that we don't assume that every man who has these kind of really toxic views of the world is a marginal crazy person. These are people that are folded into every level of the world in which we live. They aren't monsters lurking in the shadows. And Den Hollander wasn't either. We knew exactly what he believed. He was quite public about that. He presented his beliefs in courts of law. And yet we all then act like we are quite surprised when he acts on a set of beliefs that very much foretold the violence that would follow.
There are those who say who are part of this anti-woman movement, anti-feminist movement, that they've been left behind, that they've been denied opportunities. Can you help us to understand a little bit more where that comes from? How do they get to that conclusion, given the World Economic Forum places the U.S. at something like 75th in the world in terms of women's relative power to men and federal representation? So how do men get there, men like him?
I think when you're used to being a member of a dominant class, and having the world frankly kind of cater to you, right? Having pop culture reflect your views, your interests, your way of life, having the halls of power being filled with people who look like you, who share your experiences, who share your views. When that starts to change, when we start to approach something that looks a little bit more like equality, that feels or can feel like a loss for people who have had that kind of unquestioned dominance. And I think that's what you see among a lot of men who are part of these reactionary groups. I think the more extreme of them make up the quote unquote manosphere online, which
That's a
includes it.
word.
It's
That's
a
a thing.
word.
Like the manosphere. Oh my goodness.
Yeah, I should figure out who coined that so I can give them credit. I'm not sure. I'll Google it
No
after the show.
kidding.
But that encompasses, yes, the sort of incels, like people like Elliot Rodger. But it also encompasses, the MRAs, the men's rights activists, which I think is kind of where Den Hollander
You have
falls.
all sorts of acronyms
I
today, and
know,
these
sorry. It's the worst.
but it's important that we understand these. I mean, as you say, this is a real thing.
Well, and I think, post Elliot Rodger, there's been this assumption that, angry men online are all quote unquote incels. And, that there have been a series of self-identified incels who have leveraged this kind of public mass violence against women. And that's an important thing to recognize. But there are also men, who are married to women, or who are divorced from women, or who are quote unquote pickup artists, right? Who brag about their incredible, sexual power when it comes to women, who are still nevertheless all part of this kind of misogynist online stew, who, despite these totally different interpersonal relationships, or lack thereof with women, still come to these same conclusions that men are the oppressed class, that women control. A big source of frustration for a lot of these folks are family courts. Many of them, at least anecdotally, are men who have been accused of violence against women, who have lost divorce proceedings, or not lost, but
Hmm.
gone through
And
divorce
they're
proceedings,
angry.
who have lost custody, and they're very angry. And so what really does, as much as all of these men present themselves as these kind of manly, hypermasculine caricatures, at least to me, what does seem to be the sort of connective tissue is this deep sense of victimization, and a deep identification, with the process of not having universal power and authority over women and often children in their lives, is for these men a huge affront, a huge insult, and evidence that they are somehow the victim.
So, with that, we have Dr. Katz on. And as we were thinking about this particular show, we very well could have had guests that were all women. But Dr. Katz has been studying in this space and has been writing about and talking about. He has a TED talk that's been viewed over and over again about why it's important that men speak out and that men recognize the sexism, the racism that's involved in cultures of toxic masculinity. You've been so vocal and so active on this. I want you to start first, Dr. Katz, by helping us with the definition of incels. What does that mean? We hear the terminology bandied about, but for some of our listeners, they may not know exactly what it means. Can you help us with that?
Thank you very much for having this conversation and having me be a part of it. And I appreciate the
Pleasure
conversation.
to
And
have you on the show.
hey,
Absolutely.
absolutely, it's all good. I mean, incel stands for involuntarily celibate. It's a fairly recent, if you will, term over the last number of years where people talked about this sort of a one segment of the men's rights universe, so-called men's rights universe or manosphere, that's particularly extreme, but tends to be young men who are heterosexually inclined, who um, are really angry at women for depriving them of the sex or the sexual contact that they feel is their, birthright, if you will. And I mean, there are way more people in the anti-feminist world and even the men's rights world, which are not necessarily the same exact thing,
So
than
there are
there are
whole
incels.
communities. So there are communities. There's an incel community, a men's rights community, and then the anti-feminist community. Is this what you're telling us?
Yeah, I mean, some of it there's some overlap, but incel is a much more specific term. I think the vast majority of men who are engaged in the men's rights movement or who would identify themselves as anti-feminist, which would include, by the way, if you're talking about anti-feminist, that's a broader term that would include lots of mainstream politicians in the United States. So I think we have to
Point
be,
taken, given last week.
or given 2016 or 2012 or 2008 or every election virtually, there's anti-feminism is a big part of our the political backlash in the last 50 years against women's in a multiracial, multi-ethnic sense, progress. But I think it's important to say that the incel movement is a very small number, but because of the violent acts of whether it's Elliot Rodger in Isla Vista, Santa Barbara, or this Alex Manassian in Toronto, Canada, who killed a bunch of people by driving up on a street crowded with a sidewalk crowded with people, and then claiming, at least in proclaiming, that Elliot Rodger, the murderer in Isla Vista, Santa Barbara, California, was a hero, if you will. These people, these are terrorist acts that get a huge amount of attention, but I don't think they represent anything like the political strength or the social presence more broadly of the either men's rights or the broader anti-feminist universe. Can I just say one other thing, just for context, historical
Mhm.
context? The men's rights movement has been around much longer than social media, and people in the battered women's movement, and myself included, as an activist and an educator, and in that space for many decades. Well before there was social media, there was an organized group of men and some women who were part of the men's rights movement, who have made life difficult for women in the battered women's movement for since the late 1970s and the early 1980s.
We're going to get to that, right? Because one of the things that we see with the advancement of the incel movement and even the anti-feminist movement and the men's rights movement has been the use of internet, right? So as you're sharing with us, a lot of this is not it's not new. But I do want you to help us understand who Elliot Rogers was and how he fits into this. People might hear that name and wonder, should they go on Google and now find out more about this person? But you can help us right here. Who was he?
He was a young man who, in his early 20s, who was clearly angry at women for, as he put it, sexually rejecting him, and video, he recorded himself talking about his anger, his frustration, his resentment towards women, in particular what he called stuck up women in sororities, in a sorority culture at the University of California, Santa Barbara. And then he ended up murdering a couple of his male housemates or apartment mates. And then he had this plan to go kill a bunch of women at a sorority. He was interrupted during the course of that plan, so he didn't particularly enact his initial homicidal agenda, although he did end up killing something like 5 people. I'm not sure exactly, but he became kind of a folk hero in a very twisted way because he was a very disturbed individual. But when I say disturbed, I don't mean to absolve him of responsibility for his crimes, but he clearly, anybody, you don't have to be a clinician to watch the videotape of his manifesto about the world and about women and see that he was not well. But at the same time, he was, like so many of these men and others, who commit acts of egregious violence that are based in some kind of sociological or power imbalance. He was a manifestation of that cultural belief system, even though it was an extreme version of misogyny, if you will. It's not that he was
Right.
wildly unique as much as he was hyper normal.
Well, I want to include Dr. Grundy here. You have a forthcoming book that addresses masculinity. You study it, and you're bringing special attention to race.
Thank you for that question, because I think it's a really good one when we contextualize this stuff. So, one of the things that I study the most is really cultures of men and how masculine cultures are racialized, right? There's no gendered culture that isn't racialized. So when I study campus sexual assault, I'm looking at racialized rape culture, and that is always historically situated, right? And there's no rape culture in any institution that's removed from its larger context. So when you ask that question about sort of what is the historical lens on these things, and particularly a racial historical lens, well, one of the things we need to understand is that violence is the language, it's the native tongue of American white masculinity, right? Politically, it's the native tongue. It's how this country was founded. It's what they did to establish this country's economy, which is a slaveocracy. So violence is violence. Sexual violence is not non-violence. It's not some, removed from the spectrum of violence. And so I think that's the first part of it, is that in this country, our idea of what we would call hegemonic masculinity, that idea of this dominant form of almost aspirational masculinity, is always one that can exert violence. And in fact, it exerts violence and it suppresses other forms of communication of language, right? So it suppresses emotional language, it suppresses emotional intelligence. Think of what we glorify amongst men. It's usually this idea of being a stoic, except for when it comes to things like anger and rage, or having power over people. We highly associate masculinity with having power over people. So when we think about the history of race in this country, one of the things that's very interesting to think about is that white men have really, of course, cornered the market on power. And sometimes when I think about mass shootings currently, even though I want to be clear, what is consistent about male violence is masculinity. White men are not really disproportionately dominating of these acts of male violence. It's men. But it tends to be men who have access to guns. And that's where I think you get the interplay of race there, because we're talking about which groups of men have more access to guns, or more likely to be gun owners. And there's some demographic effect in that. But when we look, historically, in terms of what groups of men had access to violence as their language, well, Black men tended to be hyper surveilled in this country, and even as there was forms of violence within Black communities. Black men's violence was always hyper criminalized, and in fact, just Black humanity was criminalized, right? Black literacy was criminalized,
Well, it
black.
was profitable criminalizing. I mean, it's
Exactly.
the exception clause. It's the punishment
Exactly.
clause of the 13th Amendment that no one pays
Exactly.
attention to,
So,
right? I mean,
after
yeah.
slavery, this idea of neo-slavery was based on Black criminality, right? Was based on what you could criminalize Black people for. And so in that we have this interesting paradox, and I think one of the most important narratives of American violence comes out of that period, in which, one, of course, America as a country, as an economy, is founded on sexual violence against African women, period. And it's founded on violence against First Peoples, period, right? And slavery was just a complete form of violence. So that's, I think, the first thing. The profitability of sexual violence against women put this language of rape into a capitalist type of incentive. That rape became,
So let me just say right there. So what you're basically saying is that, look, we could look at this as a contemporary problem, or we could
mhm,
actually do the work of understanding this as a
right,
longer enterprise that
right.
actually roots back hundreds of years. Is that
Right.
what you're saying?
Yeah, absolutely. Because when we look today at the men who tend to do these types of acts, I think that part of what happens, if I can explain this well, is that often we see men who are resentful that they do not have the type of total power, sexual power that men in generations before them had. It's this sort of idea of what is the purchase of masculinity. When we just heard, talking about men who perceive, women as getting ahead. Well, that also has to do with comparing themselves to generations of men before. And if you compare yourselves to generations of white men before who had complete power,
Yeah.
you feel this
It's
slight
it's
against the generation.
complicated then. Yeah,
Right.
I really appreciate your grounding that. So I want to come back to you, Jill, and then open it up, which is then to think about this longer nexus that we've just heard about from Dr. Grundy, and how the role of the internet has perhaps put an accelerant on the kinds of notions that that she's talking about. Do you think that the internet has played a role here, and if so, how?
Yeah, I think the point that Dr. Katz made earlier, that the internet didn't invent these ideologies, is an important one, but it certainly has accelerated them. And Dr. Grundy's point that, and I'm radically oversimplifying this, but you can't understand patriarchy without understanding white supremacy, and you can't understand white supremacy without patriarchy. That these are interlinking systems that are you know profoundly, deeply, by their inventions related to each other, knitted together, inseparable. Um, of course, those things were not invented by the internet, but the internet, as much as it has given feminists huge amounts of sort of connective power, right? As much as the connective power of the internet has helped to fuel the movement for Black lives, has helped to fuel anti-racist movements. It's been an incredible tool for activism and connection around the world for social justice movements. Of course, it serves the same purpose for
For the darker
reactionary.
side. Sure.
Yeah,
I mean, we see
right,
that with
exactly.
white
Hate
supremacy
movements.
groups, right? I mean,
Yep.
this is, but I also wonder too, Jill, what about this question of youth? There are some parents who are raising alarm bells about their sons. And this is also, I think, where the internet could play a role. Have you been looking into any of this about how the sort of online culture, the sort of toxic masculinity is reaching young people?
Yeah, it's a great question and really important. I'm actually just about to publish a book about millennials and generation divides between baby boomers and millennials. And one of the
What's the
things that
title of the book?
it's
What's it?
called "Okay, Boomer, Let's Talk: How My Generation Got
Okay.
Left Behind." So I'm
Okay.
contractually obligated to tell everybody to buy it. Um,
Buy her book.
but one of the things that in all the research I was doing for that book that stood out is how lonely and disconnected millennials are. So there was one survey that was looking at, essentially asked people, how many friends do you have? How many acquaintances do you have? And boomers were really well connected. They had lots of friends, lots of acquaintances. But 1 in 5 millennials said they had 0 friends and 0 acquaintances.
Hmm. Mm.
which is sort of a shocking number.
That
And
is a shocking number. Can you repeat that for
yeah,
people? For that went by quickly.
yeah, 1 in 5 millennials said they had zero friends and zero
0
acquaintances.
friends and 0
Um,
acquaintances. How is that
how
possible?
is that possible, right? And that obviously that doesn't count, if you're living with your parents, right? You're it's not like you're necessarily living by yourself, but um,
But still there can be isolation there too,
there's
even if you
intense
are living
isolation.
with right, yeah.
And so, I do think millennials and even those younger than us, Gen Zers, are more isolated, more lonely than you would assume, given that, we're also more likely to live in these big dynamic cities and we're all on social media. And, you would guess
Mhm.
that this, has a kind of connective social power. But I think in reality, there are a great many of us who, are living lives of profound isolation. And I think for those folks, especially, if you find people online, um, who affirm your pre-existing views, who tell you that you're important, and who also kind of affirm your sense of victimhood, of your sense of everything that has kind of gone wrong in your life, has an external cause, um, and that it's and it has a very simple cause, right? I mean, this is the logic of white supremacists too, that
Mhm.
it's
It
quite
sounds like in
easy,
some ways America too,
right?
think
Sure.
about it, people who are, looking to have, news framed according to their ideology or
Right. And obviously, people on the left are not immune from this either, right? This isn't just a totally right wing dynamic. But essentially the ground is quite fertile for young folks who
Mhm.
are internet savvy, who understand, how to make connections online, who maybe don't quite understand as well, or haven't had to make connections offline. It's and as we all know, as I'm sure many of us have experienced, it's easier to say kind of jerky things on Twitter when you're not
Mhm.
looking somebody in the face.
That's right.
um, and yeah, so I do think this sort of millennial isolation, loneliness, um, this sense of your computer and the internet can be a gateway to the rest of the world. I think what we didn't quite realize that now we're understanding is actually the way that many, for example, YouTube algorithms work. Is not to open up an entire new world to you, but to send you down one particular and narrow rabbit hole. Um,
Exactly, and that
to kind of
that
slowly
feed
warm that water.
continuous yet that continuous loop, in fact, down that, rabbit hole. I wonder, are we as a society taking this seriously? Has it reached a point, these conversations regarding incels and toxic masculinity and the kind of anti-feminist movement, has it reached a point in which there is a broader social understanding, or does it just seem isolated to the kind of experts that I have on the show this morning? You all know about this. You all research about this. You write books, you give TED Talks and so forth. But are people in our society coming to understand this better?
My work has been for years and years looking at the intersections of masculinities and race and sexual orientation. In other words, all the different sort of identities, but centered around men's violence against women and children and other men. And there has been a movement of men well beyond a handful of intellectuals or academics for the last 40 plus years who have been looking critically at masculinities in the context of multiracial feminism, starting in the 1970s, critiquing the culture of sort of sexual inequality and gender inequality with intersectional lens all along, and yet we don't get there's very little in the public discourse about men who are challenging sexism or standing with women or feminist women in opposing men's violence against women. And so what's much
How
more
large is that crowd?
not particularly large. I mean, it's tiny compared to the level of the problem, but even I mean, I still live in a universe where when I get an op-ed published, my colleagues are like, "Good job, you got." I mean, like finally somebody's in the mainstream is hearing that there's actually men out there who are supportive of feminism. What you hear much more likely is the backlash kind of narrative, which I appreciate and understand.
But
And
don't you find that that backlash narrative is actually important?
yeah, oh, absolutely. I mean, I spend my life working against that backlash narrative, but I have to say also, there's a in the mainstream discourse about say the Black Lives Matter movement in the United States and in Europe, um, or I mean, actually backing up in the discourse about the white supremacy movements that
Let's
have been
start there.
growing.
Yes.
Yeah, in the United States and Europe over the past number of years, accelerated with the election of Trump and then others in Europe. Um, the mainstream discussion is all about the race and racial backlash and backlash against increasing ethnic integration in societies and immigration and such, which is obviously really important part of what's really happening here and in Europe. But what's also happening is there's organized movements of men, white men, who are not just resisting racial and ethnic integration and immigration, but the rise of women and feminism and the LGBT movements. So anti-feminism is really at the heart of the white supremacy movement here in the United States and in Europe. But the anti-feminism part of it it gets really short shrift in mainstream discourse and even academic inquiry. I think Dr. Grundy's comments about you can't study, or Angel's comments about you can't study one without the other. You can't study white supremacy without talking about patriarchy and vice versa. But the racial discourse gets way more attention than the gendered racial discourse. And I think that's a really critical point.
Well, yeah, it's a critical point. It's a historical point. I think that this is a really important point in which we've reached in this conversation about the intersections of sex and race and so forth. Because in this, there are some that say that a central part of the problem that we have here is that men just simply don't have the opportunities that girls have. That the boys don't have the opportunities that girls have, men don't have the opportunities that women have. How do you respond to that? And how do you help us to understand that with all of the expertise that you bring to this?
This is a right question, because higher ed is, all in the center of this question, as are many of our initiatives around young men and boys. And so, let's be clear. So, maybe few people know this, maybe in your audience don't. Affirmative action in terms of college admissions has overwhelmingly benefited white males. Why? Because coming out of high school, women tend to be better students. They have higher GPAs. They write better. They tend to be better students, and it looks that way on their application. So college admissions officers are actually sort of like, really, they dig deep, scraping the barrel to balance out the gender ratios of incoming classes.
There would be people who would be listening who would be offended by what you say, but it's accurate.
It's substantiated. I mean, we can take offense to what happened, but that
empirically,
it's empirically substantiated that this is what's happening. So yes, basically college admissions, this idea that that boys are so behind. Well, it's not looking at like, if we were to really look at merit, then colleges would be overwhelmingly women.
Mm-hmm.
If we were to really base admissions on merit, I think that the narrative around not only male exceptionalism, but also, let me caveat that how that gets racialized. So black male exceptionalism is this term by our legal scholar, Paul Butler. And it's basically the language with which we articulate public issues as being male issues, in this case, black male issues, when they're really not, right? So we articulate statistics when we talk about, K through 12 schooling, when we talk about the quote unquote achievement gap, right? We talk about that as though, oh, well, black boys are suffering far worse than any other group in America, when that's not. Black girls actually have a wider gap from white girls than black males have from white males when we look at achievement, we look at punishment, etc. So there's a way in which we constantly articulate our language as though boys, males are the urgency. And there's also, when it comes to white males, a way in which we articulate language of lack of accountability for white males, right? So, for example, if there were a group of all hijabi wearing Muslim women carrying AKs and shooting up theaters and shooting up schools, we would not hesitate to call that what it is. We do, we basically.
Or if Roy Den Hollander himself had been a Muslim man or a Muslim woman,
we will be talking about flight bans and travel bans all this week, right? And Roy Den Hollander, let's make it clear, he was a serial killer. He had
Mhm.
murdered another man in the men's rights activism group days before. He was on he was on a flight pattern. And
Mhm.
his interaction with Judge Esther Salas is that he had actually been attracted to her at first and wanted to ask her out, and then decided that she was moving too slow on one of his cases. He was a very litigious, one of these
Mhm.
rapid
But
wealthy
one
guys.
of the things that you're sharing with us then is that there's a way in which something that's staring us in the face that we as a
Yes,
society really aren't dealing with. Turns out that there's a whole lot of behind the scenes giving and
there.
support that's
Yes,
taking
yes.
place
There's
for
a
boys.
whole lot of accommodation for men and boys. There's a whole lot of affirmative action for men and boys, and particularly white men have been overwhelmingly, beneficiaries of that. And I think that, one of the things that's important that I just heard Jackson say is that, when we think about anti-feminism, right? When we think about this opposition, that is not marginalized. That is the mainstream political rhetoric that comes out of this idea of blaming, first of all, mother blaming, but in a more politically macro way, right? So the idea that the problems with America somehow started the family unit, and the family unit was destroyed by women's
Mhm.
liberation, right? This
Yeah.
is not fringe. That is
Well,
Paul Ryan.
Yeah, no, that's kind of ahistorical. I often think about, posters from the antebellum era that
Right,
advertise the selling of mulattoes and mulattas, and I can't help but think like the original destruction of family took place right there.
right.
So given what we're talking about, right? It is not just the incels, not just Roy Den Hollander. I want us to pivot and think about something else. And this involved Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who was accosted by a fellow member of Congress. Let's listen to a clip.
About 2 days ago, I was walking up the steps of the Capitol when Representative Yoho suddenly turned a corner, and he was accompanied by Representative Roger Williams, and accosted me on the steps right here in front of our nation's Capitol. I was minding my own business, walking up the steps, and Representative Yoho put his finger in my face. He called me disgusting. He called me crazy. He called me out of my mind. And he called me dangerous. And then he took a few more steps. And after I had recognized his comments as rude, he walked away and said, "I'm rude. You're calling me rude." I took a few steps ahead, and I walked inside and cast my vote, because my constituents send me here each and every day to fight for them. I walked back out, and there were reporters in the front of the Capitol, and in front of reporters, Representative Yoho called me, and I quote, "a f***ing bitch." These are the words that Representative Yoho levied against a congresswoman.
If that's what can happen to a member of Congress who's a woman, what does this say, Jill, about women in everyday work life?
Well, and if that's what they're saying to your face, what are they saying behind your back, right?
Oh my, that's a very good point.
I mean, I think gosh, it would have been hard to script a moment that was kind of more on the nose.
You
um,
almost can't make that up, can you?
it's so, I mean, it's so totally believable, but as another iteration of that, if a screenwriter had written it, it would have been cut
Well, would
for
people even
not being
exactly,
subtle
it would have
enough.
been yeah, no, it might have been on the kind of editing room floor because people might have said, "Well, who would ever do that?" And who would ever do that in front of reporters? Do you think if reporters hadn't been there that that AOC would have been able to come out as she did in response?
No, no way. No, I mean, anytime, it's a woman's word against a man's, we believe the man's, right? I mean, we saw this in the Brett Kavanaugh confirmation hearings. We saw it in the Clarence Thomas confirmation hearings. Um, you know, we've we've seen, unless you have, as was the case with, for example, Harvey Weinstein,
Mhm.
double digit numbers of women speaking out about your bad acts. then fine, maybe the weight of a man's word is, considered
And
less heavy than
you've really said
women's.
something there, right? Because it takes so many women, right?
Right.
So
I mean, one
it
woman is
takes
never
dozens.
enough.
It's not enough. You have to have dozens of women come forward in order for one woman to be believed, right? She has to be flanked by an army.
Exactly. So that sort of unfair weighting of women's words versus men's absolutely would have meant that Ocasio-Cortez would not have been believed, that she would have been, then sort of portrayed as hysterical or overly sensitive, which is already happening. And, to me, what's interesting is the moment, of course, the moment itself, right? This sense of entitlement, of such deep misogyny that you would say that to a female colleague to her face in front of reporters. That obviously speaks volumes. But then the way that the press talks about it afterwards, and the way
That's
that both
right.
Yoho and Cortez
It was
themselves talked
horrible.
about it. It was horrible. She was presented, I think there was a piece, and I don't remember if this was in the Times or the Post, but the
It
framing
was in the
was,
Times.
it was about her, using this moment to, increase her platform, and as opposed to
Exactly.
this woman that
Let's
just experienced workplace sexual harassment. He's
exactly.
talking about
And
it.
in another context where her male colleague might have been made to be accountable for what he did. Let's play a second clip that you're referring to in terms of how the media lost its minds. Let's listen.
Mr. Yoho mentioned that he has a wife and 2 daughters. I am 2 years younger than Mr. Yoho's youngest daughter. I am someone's daughter, too. My father, thankfully, is not alive to see how Mr. Yoho treated his daughter. My mother got to see Mr. Yoho's disrespect on the floor of this house towards me on television. And I am here because I have to show my parents that I am their daughter and that they did not raise me to accept abuse from men.
So, Dr. Grundy, it is that clip to which Jill was referring to where there was backlash. How do we understand backlash for that commentary? It kind of reminds me of Sojourner Truth. Women like,
yes, ain't I a daughter, right?
Exactly.
It's, if we can get into the real thick of the brush here.
Let's get into the real thick of the brush.
How to say this? The backlash, I can imagine, comes from this idea that she just critiqued the ploys of white femininity as well, right? See, that she's calling out this complicity in which, in using his wife and daughters as a shield, there is some complicity in that. And when we look at white women shielding white men's purely bad, egregious behavior, and I think that, I've experienced that kind of backlash of I think that when we fail to racialize these gendered experiences, we fail to understand the complicities of power within them, right? That women don't experience powers or lack of power the same. And that, what she did was calling out a device that men do all the time, which is, the I was raised by my mother, I have a wife, I have sister. This is if we could just get men to understand that, you don't need to be related to women to see them as humans, right?
Mm-hmm,
but what she was really calling out was this sort of sacred covenant between, when we were talking about, anti-feminists also including women, yes. Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Feminists and women are not the same thing. There are,
Well, in fact, on that note, it's very interesting to think about when Justice Kavanaugh was going through his confirmation hearings, and I couldn't help but notice little girls flanked behind him. And it was an interesting visual. They were there, and I wondered if that perhaps was a form of a buffer, given that part of what was the discussion, part of the questioning of Justice Kavanaugh, then Judge Kavanaugh, was about past sexual harassment.
Yes. Oh, absolutely. I mean, they were used as blatant pawns. I mean, Trump uses Ivanka as a blatant pawn, and in fact, Ivanka, very much goes out and says, my father is, he's one of the biggest champions of women's rights. Like, there's always this use of women who are in positions in which they are dependent on their power relationship to you, right? Their power is actually sourced through you. I think there's a tendency to use those women as pawns. That is part of it. It is the I have Black friends of white male patriarchy, right? But other groups of men do this as well. But that really is, I think, that's a huge part of it. And then, of course, because women themselves have some agency in that, I think that we have to really talk about what does race present when we talk about the coalitions of power formed between those with shared anti-feminist interests. I mean, there really is this idea that this is a very popular thread, I think, particularly amongst conservative women, that they are sort of the bulldogs against feminism, that they see it as like, look at me,
How did Sarah Palin
right,
describe herself as? What was it?
right.
Something with lipstick. I can't
Yeah,
remember exactly what.
a
Yeah,
pit bull with lipstick or
right.
something like that, right? The
Yes,
hockey mom with the lipstick on a
right.
pit bull. But this idea that, like, I will do the bidding of being a woman who says that feminism has been bad. But in Sarah Palin's case, she actually flipped feminism to mean something it didn't mean, right? So she called herself a feminist, but for
hmm
her, feminism was this waterless, meaningless idea of like, well, I have choice, right? But that's, I mean, that's not at
So,
all like actually counts.
I can't help but think that sometimes when, you have shows or I look at what you all are writing and what you're talking about, it'd be very easy for us to all be depressed. And and rightfully so, one should say, with given the specter of violence within these spaces. And we haven't even talked about domestic violence and how these matters end up surfacing within homes. Jackson surfaced that a bit at the top of the show, but I want to ask each of you, just where you see where you see other issues that we ought to be concerned about, and if you could briefly answer that, because then I want us to think about, and not in a kind of lofty rainbowish kind of way, but are there any kinds of silver linings or hope that we see coming forward, given the fact that we're recognizing these issues? So first, what are the other spaces beyond Congress, beyond, sadly, the kind of violence that's visiting people's doorsteps? Where else ought we to be concerned about toxic masculinity? Jill, I'll start with you.
Everywhere.
Okay, that's like the reality. Okay, yeah, okay, there you go. That's a great answer. And it's true. True. It's all around us. All right. Okay. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, I mean, look, we live in a society, right? And this idea that there's some significant differential between what happens on the floor of Congress and all of the factors that animate what's acceptable and what's not, what people say and what they choose not to. The idea that that's somehow radically different from what happens in our kind of quote unquote real lives, or that what happens online is different than what happens, in person. Those are all, I think, kind of false distinctions. So, yes, I mean, the home, obviously, as you're talking about domestic violence and violence at the hands of intimate partners, that, of course, is on the same spectrum of violence as Roy Den Hollander, killing the son and husband of a federal judge, and killing kind of one of his own men's rights compatriots. To me, what was so interesting, I mean, among many things, about the Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez moment with Representative Yoho, was the way in which it kind of crystallized this very often sort of unspoken sense that women have, right? Of that guy's calling me a bitch in his head.
Mm-hmm.
I think all women know what that feels like, even if he does,
Right.
even if those words don't come out of his mouth.
Right.
And to have that finally be said, to kind of cross over that space, and make real what women, I think, often question: am I imagining it? say, no, you're not.
And there it is, right?
There it is.
Right, exactly,
You know, I
because
think
he just said it out right in front of reporters.
Exactly. You know, is incredibly powerful. You know, and
Mhm.
obviously women aren't the only people who experience this. You know, this is certainly something that a great many African American writers have written about, you know, the sort of unsaid N-word, right?
Mhm.
At the hands of white people in these moments of, you know, what is
Hey,
clearly
intersection of that for Black women,
right,
like
exactly.
the double whammy of it. It's true. Jackson, what about you? So what are the other things that we ought to be thinking about within this space?
Well, I mean, I think the ongoing global pandemic of men's violence against women,
Mhm.
and children, and one of the great things about Representative Ocasio-Cortez's speech was that because she's such a prominent figure and because she said it on the floor of the United States Congress, it got all kinds of attention. But it's giving voice to, billions of women's experience. I think with the missing piece in the past generation or two, there's been incredible leadership on the part of women in a multiracial, multi-ethnic sense in the US and all over the world against sexual assault and domestic violence and sexual harassment and everything else. Incredible leadership from on the part of women, but really appalling silence on the part of, millions, if not billions of men. And there
Mhm.
have been some men who've been part of the struggle, if you will, and been allies and activists all along,
We
but
need
a
more.
tiny number in comparison, as I said earlier, to the scope of the problem. And I think we need a whole lot more from men across
Mhm.
the board in terms of actively supporting and supporting women in feminist leadership, but also actively challenging and interrupting other men's enactment of sexism. For example, I would have
Mhm.
liked to see many more men in the United States Congress publicly uh, support
Condemn what
yes,
happened, right?
Ocasio-Cortez and dissociate themselves from Representative Yoho's remarks. I know some did, but I think that's a big one. In other words, we need more men engaged in this struggle. I also think we need more white men who are willing to challenge both white privilege and men's privilege or masculine privilege or male supremacy. And I think one of the ways to do that is to support progressive candidates who support a feminist agenda at the ballot box. And I do think there is sexism on the left. There are many men in progressive, white men, for example, who are in
For
progressive
sure.
social movements who are also sexist, and
Sure.
they get a pass on their sexism. And I think one of the challenges from me and a lot of other my friends and colleagues for years have been, it's not just right wing men. Obviously, right wing men and men who are dedicated to anti-feminist politics need to be challenged, but even the sexism of men on the left, including white men who are on the streets protesting for racial justice, and I applaud them. But some of those men need to be introspective about their participation in the culture of
Sure.
sexism, and
And yeah,
that gets real personal. And that's one of the
absolutely.
reasons why it's so challenging is we're talking about intimate relationships and not just political movements.
What are the other spaces that we ought to be shining a light on when we're having a conversation about anti-feminism and
Oh,
incels and
okay. So I first want to say thank you, Jackson, for just making the point that because what we know from theory is that really cultures of masculinity and really this type of toxic masculinity, oftentimes male violence is about men impressing men. So the point of men have to do the job of condemning and denouncing other men is important because men do it for the regards of other men. So that's
so
important.
it's like men seeking the male
It's
gaze.
men seeking the male gaze. That's what we know from masculinity theory. Men do these things for the approval of men. It
Well, it's interesting that you should say that. I don't mean to interrupt, but one of the things that flashes to mind right at that moment for me was looking at sort of the images of lynchings.
yeah, of
Men
course.
standing
Of
around with
course.
other men
Pressing other
smiling.
men at how they handle black people. Yoho does this as he's accompanied by his male colleague up the steps, right? It's I mean, this is overwhelmingly patriarchy is not just about the relationship between women and men, it's about the relationship between men and men.
Yeah,
And
well,
that's why it's
patriarchy knows
so
no gender.
exactly. That's why it's so racialized and class, etc. To your question about where can we see this otherwise, I'm going to open up a can of worms. But
Okay.
but
It has to be a quick can, but open it. Open it.
misogyny is a horseshoe politics issue because, as Jackson just said, it draws people from the left. So we see rates right now of black men supporting Trump at 24%. Black
No.
women are supporting Trump at 6%. Black women overwhelmingly, when we look at the black men who support Trump, We see some demographic features. They don't tend to be college educated, but they are attracted to a few features of Trump. And one is this idea of like this strange horseshoe that's drawn between like, well, if he's oppressed by the FBI and the government and I am too, then the enemy of, your enemy is your friend. But also they are blatantly drawn to his patriarchy. We as Black men are still fighting to get that turn at the table to be the misogynist. Like, we don't want patriarchy to end. We still want to get to that table of patriarchy. And also this idea that Trump symbolizes this thing of, this disdain for like, what anyone wants to, say about him, etc. There is a lot of draw in horseshoe politics. People you would think would see all of his other policies and be, and be aghast. They are actually drawn to Trump's misogyny, his patriarchy, and this sense of male bravado, that's how men should act. That's very dangerous, and the Russians are taking full advantage.
Really, really quickly, though, we want to be able to do this. Can you quickly just tell me anything that you see as a silver lining in having a conversation such as this? Jill, I'll start with you.
Yeah, I think the more that we're able to open up these discussions about the connections between the subtle misogyny and sexism that women live with every day, and then these bigger acts of, overt violence and harassment, the more we understand the sort of fuller picture of patriarchy. And the more we can understand how, as the old-timey feminists used to say, the personal is political, and that you really can't separate out, every day, the air we breathe, the lives we live, the small indignities and sexisms that we experience from these much more urgent kind of big picture front page of the newspaper events.
Jackson?
I think this kind of dialogue is incredibly important, and I think we need more men and more white men who are willing to engage in this conversation, both with each other and with people of color, including, of course, women of color, but also men of color. And in my experience as a longtime educator, especially around the issues of men's violence against women, I'm convinced that there's an awful lot of men, including white men, who are willing to have this conversation. You got to get them through the door. I mean, honestly, they have to come through the door, and they have to be pushed sometimes through the door. But when you get involved in the conversation, I think you find a lot of men will start sort of having aha moments and start realizing ways in which they've participated in, through their silence or their actions, a culture of abuse that they don't want to be part of. So I think there's a reason to be hopeful. I know it's easy to be pessimistic, but I think there's a reason to be hopeful. The white people in the streets for the racial justice movement is something that people have remarked upon. It's a great thing. There's a lot of young white people out in the streets protesting with Black Lives Matter. But there was an awful lot of men at the women's marches in 2017. There's an awful lot of men who support feminism and support women's rights and women's dignity. We just need to activate them.
Thank you. And what about you, Dr. Grundy?
I think there are more men who are feminists than would call themselves feminists. I think there are more men. I think particularly with younger men, I actually am a little optimistic about this in terms of, when I talk to, in my work, having to interview college age Black males, because the college age women have gone, full, like, you have to be a feminist now as a college woman, because they've gone that direction. The men have sort of caught up, like, this is the norm. Like, feminism is the norm for them. They're really not our generation. I would say the other silver lining I have is that in AOC's address, she talked about how much she was used to this type of abuse from men because she had been a service sector working woman before. And that's the bridge you see in bringing out, the flashlight on, we talk about this stuff in Elite. She's like, this is the exact same thing I was going through as a waitress. We are talking about a culture of impunity that has followed elite men, particularly white elite men.
And she was able to bring attention to that.
Bridge that. She's able to say, this is no different than the men who were accosting me in bars. This is what it is. And I'm on the steps of Congress.
I want to thank my guest for joining us today and being part of this critical and insightful conversation Thank you, Jill. Thank you, Saida. Thank you, Jackson. And to our listeners, I thank you for tuning in. We hope you join us again for our next episode, where we will be reporting, rebelling, and telling it like it is with special guests Erwin Chemerinsky, Leah Littman, Bridget Amiri, and Franita Tolson, and tackling issues addressing the Supreme Court. It will be an episode like this that you will not want to miss. So, for our guests, if we have listeners that want to connect with you through social media, where can they find you? Jill, where can they find you on social media?
You can find me at Jill Filipovic, JILLFILIPOVIC. And thank you so much, Michelle, for having me on.
Oh, it's a pleasure. We have to do it again. And what about you, Jackson?
Thank you very much. It's jacksoncats.com. That's not quite social media. It's my website. Or on Twitter at Jackson T as in Tom Cats.
All right. And for you, Saida?
I'm on LinkedIn under Saida Grundy, and I'm also on Twitter at SAI Grundy, Sai Grundy. But don't judge me. I talk a lot about irrelevant things.
And as we close, let's listen one last time to Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez as she puts into context how we should understand what happened to her.
Having a daughter does not make a man decent. Having a wife does not make a decent man. Treating people with dignity and respect makes a decent man. And when a decent man messes up, as we all are bound to do, he tries his best and does apologize. Not to save face, not to win a vote. He apologizes genuinely to repair and acknowledge the harm done so that we can all move on.
This has been your host, Michelle Goodwin, reporting, rebelling, and telling it like it is. On the Issues with Michelle Goodwin is a Ms. Magazine joint production. Kathy Spiller and Michelle Goodwin are our executive producers. Our producers are Maddie Ponce and Roxy Zoll. Our assistant producer today is Zoe Larkin, and Latiara Rashid, Rena Wakefield, and Sarah Montgomery helped with the development of this episode. The creative vision behind our work includes art and design by Brandy Phipps. Editing is by Will Alvarez and music by Chris J. Lee. Stephanie Wilner provides executive assistance.